Hey guys, it's me. Hope I didn't terrify you too much there. Today, if you hadn't already guessed, we're following on from the video I made last week. There still isn't a huge amount to talk about in the world of Halloween. This time of year is always somewhat of a dry spell between waiting for new props to awaken and be released. And of course, Halloween itself is still a fair way away. So while we're in this kind of lull period, I just thought I'd fill it with something Halloween-y, sort of. So following on from last week's video, today we are once again talking about characters of horror. I don't know why I keep on doing that, sorry. If you didn't see my video last week, I was talking about characters of horror, but classic horror. So we started off with Count Dracula, probably my favourite horror character in general. I spoke briefly about how I wasn't really into slasher movies and stuff, but I always really loved the sort of classic monster movies, particularly the old school Universal monster movies. I was always a big fan of them, so I thought that's where we'd start when we talk about these particular horror characters. And today I thought we'd talk about one of my favourites. I'm not gonna lie, up until I started researching this again, it was a film I hadn't seen for years, and I decided to rewatch it again only the other night. And I forgot how good this movie is. It's one of those movies that is somewhat overlooked by its famous predecessors, but it's still a great movie in its own right, and in its own right led on to inspiring some of the arguably best horror/action movies that have ever been created. The movie I'm talking about is, of course, The Mummy. Before we get too far into this, guys, I'd just like to ask a big helping hand from you. If you haven't yet subscribed, please subscribe, please like, please comment. It helps me out. I'd love to see this channel grow, and I hope that by the time we get to Halloween this year, the channel is pumping. I don't know what I'm doing. But without any further ado, let's just get straight into this. Unlike its predecessors, The Mummy was the first monster movie Universal Studios produced that hadn't come off the back of a novel. The year previous to its release, we'd seen both Dracula and Frankenstein's Monster, the first of Universal's releases, which was part of its Universal's classic monster franchise. The film had a star-studded cast, past cast members who had also featured both in Dracula and in Frankenstein's Monster, the most famous of which was Boris Karloff himself, who of course had played Frankenstein only the year earlier and done an amazing job as Frankenstein's Monster. Probably the most famous depiction of Frankenstein's Monster to date. So The Mummy was released in 1932, and it focuses on the story of an archaeological team led by Sir Joseph Wemple in 1921, who discover the tomb of an ancient priest named Imhotep. After discovering the mummy of Imhotep within the sarcophagus, they also find a small casket with a deadly curse on it that says that anyone who opens the casket will be cursed. The archaeologists clearly don't listen to this and decide to open the casket anyway. Now, the remains of the mummy of Imhotep, they have already deduced that he was buried in an unusual manner. Though he's wrapped like a mummy should be wrapped, it looks as though he was alive when he was buried, and no one can quite figure out why that would be. Despite the warning and the curse not to open the casket, Sir Joseph's assistant Ralph opens it anyway, finds a scroll inside, the Scroll of Thoth, and manages to decipher it. Upon deciphering it and reading it aloud, he accidentally awakens the mummy of Imhotep. And probably one of the most famous scenes from this entire movie, ironically, the most mummy related of all the scenes, because this is the only time you actually see Karloff dressed as a mummy, is Karloff awakening as the mummy and sort of just very staggering out of his sarcophagus, and he steals the Scroll of Thoth. Ralph watches him do this and just starts laughing in an insane manner, which only 1930s actors, I think, ever really got down to a T. The whole laughing maniacally and crazily. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Most of the rest of the story takes place about 10 years later, when despite his weird disfigurement, the mummy of Imhotep, now one of the undead, has managed to assimilate into Egyptian society and has given himself the rather bizarre name of Ardath Bey. Imhotep, dressed up as Ardath Bey, is certain that his long-lost love, Anck-su-namun, a princess that he tried to resurrect from the dead back in ancient Egyptian times, and this was why he was bandaged up and buried alive, because it was heresy to do such a thing. He is certain that Anck-su-namun has been reincarnated into the modern world, and so he's searching for her reincarnation. He calls upon Sir Joseph's son Frank to help him excavate a tomb which he believes to be that of the ancient princess Anck-su-namun. When they find the treasures and they unearth the tomb, they take the treasures to the Cairo Museum, but it's at that point that Ardath Bey mysteriously disappears. Around this time, Bey encounters the love interest in this story, who is a woman called Helen, who is a half Egyptian woman who bears a striking resemblance to the ancient princess Anck-su-namun, and Bey falls in love with her and is certain that this is Anck-su-namun reincarnated. It's at this point that Bey is revealed to be Imhotep, the ancient priest and the mummy himself. Mullah urges Joseph to burn the scroll of Thoth and break the curse, but Bey discovers this and hypnotizes and eventually kills Joseph, and then uses his magical powers to hypnotize Helen and takes her back to his place, and then he tells Helen who he really is and who he believes she is. Imhotep then attempts to make Helen his immortal bride by killing her, mummifying her, and then resurrecting her so that she becomes a full version of Anck-su-namun. Frank, who is the other guy who's in love with Helen, tries to stop him but cannot, and it seems that Helen is done for. But she then remembers her past life, remembers who she really was. As it turns out, she is the reincarnation of Anck-su-namun, and she prays to the goddess Isis. The statue at this point raises its hand and blasts fire, which then burns the scroll of Thoth, and the curse and the magic of Imhotep is destroyed in one hit. Imhotep turns to dust, and the movie is ended. Though The Mummy is nowhere near as high production value or as well celebrated as its predecessors Dracula and Frankenstein, I love it because it's creepy. It's really, really creepy. It's less about the real horror jumps and more about the creepy atmosphere this movie manages to produce. And Karloff himself, who by this point is so famous he is often just referred to as Karloff, portrays Imhotep so brilliantly. Even without all the mummy makeup on, he is one of the creepiest characters you'll ever see in movie. And the thing about The Mummy is, it went on to inspire a whole host of other movies, most of which weren't related to the first one, but kind of took inspiration from the first one. There are at least, I think there's 6 or 7 produced throughout both the 40s and then the 50s and 60s. Everything from The Mummy's Hand to The Mummy's Curse, and during the 50 British Hammer film productions took them on too and kind of remade them in their own sort of way. One of my favourite later adaptations of this is the 1999 version of The Mummy starring Brendan Fraser. This movie actually is less horror and more action, as they sort of try to turn it on its head a little bit, but the themes are still the same, the idea is still the same. It's still the mummy Imhotep who's come back to try and resurrect his long dead forbidden love of Anck-su-namun. They've slightly warped the story to make it more action and fun, and I as a kid really enjoyed it, but I have to say something about the old version, the 1932 version, it just has the creep factor down. The amazing part about The Mummy 2 though is that unlike the other horror movies that had come out before from Universal Studios, The Mummy obviously didn't have a novel that it came out of, unlike Dracula and Frankenstein's monster. So what did inspire The Mummy? Where did that story come from? Well, 10 years before The Mummy's release in 1932, probably one of the most astonishing and still to this date amazing archaeological discoveries was made in Egypt, and that was the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. This tomb was amazing on every level. It was one of the few that hadn't been disturbed by tomb robbers, and so the treasures that were found within to this day are still some of the greatest archaeological finds ever discovered. I'm lucky enough that I actually managed to go to Egypt and visit the pyramids and go to the Cairo Museum, and I have seen King Tutankhamun's death mask in person. And if you ever get the opportunity, you really should, because when you get to look into the eyes of that death mask, you're looking into the effigy of a person who lived 3,000 years ago. That is astonishing, and it is mental. The thing is so beautiful but so lifelike as well. You expect it to move any second as you look into its eyes. It's amazing. It really, really is. The discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb inspired a huge amount of interest in Egypt in general, but also archaeology at that time period. And basically throughout the 1920s, anything Egyptian was en vogue. But off the back of this huge amount of interest, both in the archaeology and the history of Egypt, came this secondary thing that was more whipped up by the media than anything else, which was the curse of the pharaohs. Now, there isn't actually an awful lot of evidence that any pharaoh's tombs had curses put upon them. It was just generally considered, especially by Egyptians, that disturbing the tomb of anybody, particularly a pharaoh, was clearly very bad luck and not a particularly good thing to do. But because there was such a media frenzy around the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in the first place, it did inspire a lot of interest on every level. And when strange deaths started to occur and strange things started to occur around the discovery of the tomb, that's when the media kind of whipped up this story of the pharaoh's curse. The first death that's attributed to the pharaoh's curse is that of George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who actually financed the excavation of the tomb of King Tutankhamun. Only a few months after the tomb had been discovered, of which he had witnessed it being uncovered, he nicked a mosquito bite on his neck whilst shaving, which got infected, which led to blood poisoning, which led to his death. And his is kind of considered the first official death attributed to the curse of King Tutankhamun. It wasn't just deaths that were considered part of this curse as well, but just basically unfortunate circumstances. The next weird thing that happened to a guy called Sir Bruce Ingham. His story is the weirdest, I think, because he's given a paperweight by Howard Carter, the guy who discovers the tomb, and the paperweight itself was made out of a mummified hand, which sounds like the sort of thing you shouldn't be giving to anybody, but apparently he did. And not long after receiving this mummified hand, which apparently also had a curse inscribed upon it, Ingham's house burnt down, and when they tried to rebuild it, it flooded. Now, that's probably just bad luck, but that's apparently what happened, and this was attributed to the curse. The next death attributed was George J. Gould, who was an American financier who had been present when the tomb had been uncovered. He fell ill not long after visiting the tomb and never really recovered. And although he didn't die for many months after the tomb had been discovered and eventually died of pneumonia, it was still thought this has something to do with the curse. Probably the one that caused the most hysteria was a guy called Hugh Evelyn White, who visited King Tut's tomb not long after it had been discovered. By 1924, after witnessing a whole host of bad luck and other deaths related to the tomb, this guy unfortunately, very sadly, commits suicide. But according to legend, though there is no concrete evidence this is true, he apparently, before he died, wrote something in his own blood, which simply read, "I have succumbed to a curse which forces me to disappear." Ominous. In 1929, Richard Bethel, who was the second man to enter King Tut's tomb, was found dead in a gentleman's club in London, and it was believed that he was smothered. Now, no one really knows how he died, but he was found dead there, and it was kind of a bit weird that he was found dead there. Again, attributed to the curse. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed was a guy who really didn't have much to do with the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb, except that he X-rayed King Tut's body before it was given to the Cairo Museum, and about 3 days after doing this, he fell ill and died. So, yeah, okay. The next guy was called James Henry Breasted, who was there when the tomb of King Tutankhamun's tomb was being discovered. Apparently, not long after the tomb was discovered, and he'd obviously witnessed it being discovered, he returned home to find a cobra in his canary's bird cage, and it was still in the cage after eating his canary. And this was considered incredible bad luck because the cobra was, of course, the symbol of the Egyptian pharaohs. And yeah, it was kind of a bit of a weird scenario. Breasted didn't actually die until 1935, many years after the discovery of the tomb, but he did die shortly after visiting Egypt again, so it was always kind of seen as slightly odd. The last death attributed to the curse of the pharaohs was Howard Carter himself. Now, Howard Carter didn't die until 1939, talking nearly 20 years after the discovery of the tomb. Yet many who believe in the superstition that surrounds the curse of the pharaohs still attribute it somehow to the curse of the pharaohs, that he died a full 20 years, well, 18 years after this had happened. I don't know, guys, you read into those curses whatever you wish. I think, to be honest, it was a lot of media hype and probably a lot of rubbish, but you know, it's still really interesting. And it was from them curses and from that huge amount of interest around Egypt at that time, that films like The Mummy, that have in one way or another shaped how we see modern horror and also how we help to celebrate Halloween. I mean, who hasn't dressed up as a mummy wrapped in toilet paper at least once in their life? I know I have. It plays a huge role in how we celebrate Halloween, and it plays a huge role in the classic horror genre too. And I hope if me saying this has done nothing else, you go and re-watch that old movie, because I think it's definitely worth a second glance. Anyway, guys, thank you for watching today. It's another long one, so if you're here at the end, well done you. If you could hit that subscribe button, it would help me out massively, and I will see you in the next one. Keep it spooky. Bye.